Welcome to Ostracon, a podcast that translates fragments into the whole from which they came. We're here tonight on the next installment of the Someone You Know series, where we'll be talking with people who hold interesting jobs, ones that you've heard of. You may even know somebody that does these jobs, but you never had the opportunity to ask them what it was all about and to reflect more deeply on what they do and what it means. Tonight, we're talking with a photographer, and we're going to have a chance to explore what it's like to capture life as he does. As with all the Someone You Know series, the guests remain anonymous unless at the end of the interview they choose to reveal themselves. So let me set the scene here. It's late at night. My guest and I are both a couple of night owls, which I like. I got home late yesterday after a performance of Rusalka and cast party afterward, and I'm still on a schedule where I don't have to go to bed until tomorrow. And apparently so is he. We've got a pot of Two Doves white tea in front of us on a candle, and my guest has a red folding knife that looks like he plays with from time to time when he's not exactly sure what I'm gonna ask him. So let me ask you, Mr. Photographer, to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, gee, I'm not sure what you want to know. As far as shooting photos goes, I've been doing so since I was around 8 years old, when my mom gave me a old Brownie camera and a roll of 120 film, and I remember shooting the photos and then having to wait for what seemed like a small eternity to get the negatives and the photos back, and I thought that was a really neat experience.
So you've been doing this for a long time?
Yes. Maybe not professionally for that long of a time, since I was 8, but I've been, shooting a camera for quite a bit of time.
What made you fall in love with photography?
I think it was that first experience of having shot the photos and then a period of almost forgetting that I had done it, and then having the photos come back again. I don't know how long that eternity was when I was 8 years old. It could have been a week, could have been 2 weeks, could have been a month. I don't remember. I remember my mom, taking the film to get it developed, and then there was a period of time there, where I went on about my normal life, whatever that was when I was 8, throwing rocks and climbing trees and doing things like that. And then finally the photos arrived, and it just it was kind of magical to think, oh yeah, I remembered seeing those images through the lens and the ground glass on a camera, and now I can hold them again in my hands. It was kind of like a time machine of sorts, and that's kind of what did it for me. I was hooked with that.
So I've had a chance to look at some of the things you've done, and you have collected and published some of your work. I've seen a lot of your landscape work. I've seen a lot of your cityscape works. I've seen some of your portraiture, especially your street side candid shots, which are quite poignant. But I know that you also, over the years, have done contract work for events, speakers. And that's interesting to me because you are familiar with the art form both as an artistic voice, creating a vision of your own, but also capturing the lives of others. I know you've also shot models too. What's it like to have seen photography through both of those modes?
So I actually thought about that subject on the way over tonight, and I guess to define that, it's when I was 8 and I shot those photos, it was merely just, for lack of a better word, neat to shoot photos and capture images. And at that time and for years afterwards, I really didn't think much about what I wanted the images to look like. It was just almost a matter of just composing the image, and then a circumstance of capturing something that to my eye looked interesting on film. And I shot that way for quite some time, and then it wasn't until later on in life that I started thinking about what I would like to see captured, as opposed to what I was just circumstantially capturing.
Yeah, that to me, that's a poignant distinction. The move from the item that you intend to capture and the way that you intend to capture it.
Yeah. There was
because it's almost like you're moving from a vision of the thing that you want to a vision of a cooperation with that thing to produce something that is a part of its identity and then part of the way that you receive it.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, I guess the way you worded that initially, it was how can I better phrase it? It was I was able to, at a pretty young age, to compose an image and shoot it. But as I grew older, I learned that I had the ability to control the output to varying degrees. And, that's when kind of art, I guess, kind of intersected intention. Maybe, I don't know any sculptors or artistic painters per se, but, I often wonder, when a sculptor picks up a hammer and a chisel and he starts sculpting a piece of stone, he must have some kind of idea what he wants to see as the finished product. And initially, when I was 8, 10, early teens, just shooting the camera, I had a composition in mind, but I didn't really have a desired outcome. I was kind of just carefree, trying to create something. And then later in life, I was able to be more in control of what the finished product would look like.
So let me ask you, what does it do to the relationship with your subject when your own intentionality enters into it?
What does it do to the subject? Well,
in the sense that it's not just I'm capturing you as a person or a beautiful scene or whatever it might be, but that when your own intention enters into it, do then you become kind of an unseen part of the frame, how does it blur the line between the opposite sides of the camera, if at all?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, and I would assume that most other photographers can relate to that, or artists, or writers, or engineers. But anybody that has an influence over their work. I had a shoot the other day that we talked about briefly, and I had to shoot somebody that was trying to get into politics, and basically they hired me because they wanted me to portray them in a good light. They wanted me to make them look good.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly, if I had shot that person in a way that I would have maybe when I was 8 years old, they wouldn't have wanted me. But I have mastered or acquired skills that allow me to shape that final product I'm given a lot of latitude, on a job like that as a photographer, because they come to me because of my skill, I guess, and the work that they've seen me produce previously. So I'm able to visually see things or imagine things, and then, like I said before, to impose my will, if you would, on the final outcome. There's a lot of things nowadays as far as technology that allows us to really shape a photograph. Where years back, maybe somebody like Ansel Adams didn't have so many luxuries as we do nowadays.
He had to wait for the moment.
Well, he had to wait for the moment, and they had some rudimentary technology with analog film and chemicals that they could use, but the latitude nowadays is just, it's almost unimaginable for some people as to how you can shape a final photograph.
So you said something there that was interesting to me, because we talked about that ability to realize a vision.
Mm-hmm.
And what that does to your relationship with your subject. But you also said they hired you because they had their own vision that they wanted to be,
mm-hmm.
wanted to achieve. And so it makes me ask, what does the intentionality of the subject do to your art? It's not just, as a photographer, I have a vision that is poignant for me and I want to realize it. But the subject themselves is coming to you saying, maybe, I don't want you to capture me as I am. I want you to capture me as I see myself. What does that do to your relationship with your subject?
Well, certainly there's more than meets the eye, I guess, for lack of a better pun. But I've had subjects that want me to make them look better than what they perceive of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a common practice. What I think the question was, what does it do to me? And it doesn't bother me. I see that frequently with paid work, where if it's a person, I can give you an example where I had a job shooting a wedding, and the bride-to-be basically came to me and asked me to make her look better
mm-hmm.
than what she perceived as herself, which I didn't think there was a problem with how she looked, but she did.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand, we live in a world now that people want to look better than perhaps they perceive themselves. And it's kind of an unfortunate reality, but I think that's commonplace nowadays.
What's it like to have someone's self-image in your hands? Or do you not see it that way?
Yeah, I see it like this job I just did this past week for this person that's entering politics. It's a big deal. I can't.
And we should say, just for context, you've shot some extremely high-ranking people.
Yeah. It's stressful in the sense that, again, I understand what their intent is, and my interpretation is what's ultimately guiding me. So, if somebody comes to me and wants, I'm basically trying to sell that person to an audience, usually. Kind of like a used cars salesman sometimes. I'm not saying that's the relationship, but I've worked for real estate agents that want me to portray a structure or a home or some property in the best possible way. And there's a double-edged sword there, in the sense that I can really manipulate a photograph to make it look stunning. And the problem with that is, if a potential buyer comes along and the place is really a dump, then on one end of the spectrum, the selling agent might feel really good about the photos, but the prospective buyer might come in and say, wow, this place looks much worse in real life. Mm-hmm. So there's a fine line between reality and something beyond that.
So you make an interesting point that you have a relationship not only with your subject, but with your viewer.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
What responsibilities do you think you have to a subject or to a viewer? And by the way, maybe this is different for a photo of an official, of somebody, versus a photo that is known to be artistic. It's kind of like telling the truth in nonfiction versus people understanding fiction to be fantasy or something.
Right.
Does that enter into what you do?
So, run that question by me again.
What responsibilities do you think you have to a subject or to a viewer, if any?
Well, I guess it depends on the roles that the subject and or the viewer play. In other words, the subject could be the purchaser or the owner of the final work. And the viewer could also potentially be somebody that's subjected to what I produce. In the sense that if I'm, again, using an example of something like real estate or product that is for sale, and I'm photographing that, I think there's an ethical perspective that needs to be considered as far as false advertising would go. I can take a photograph of a house or a product and make it look much better in a photo than it does in real life. And from an ethical perspective, I could easily mislead somebody that might be interesting in that product or that property, and that would be wrong. And I've come to appreciate that working with people like real estate agents, that they for the most part understand that perspective. Now, if I'm shooting photos for a person that, I don't know, for lack of a better word, wants to sell themselves, then the onus, I think, is on them to let their viewer know that maybe that's not what they really look like. You know, maybe somebody needs a photo for a LinkedIn kind of headshot or something. And, you know, I've worked with people that want me to, you know, they usually quip, oh, can you make me look 20 years younger and, you know, 20 pounds lighter? Well, I could possibly do that. But, you know, is that what you really want? Is my thought or question to them. So again, it depends on the relation from a business perspective, I think, as to the final outcome of the product and how that would affect a viewer. You know, I guess I could point to, you know, maybe weathermen on the TV. I think the majority of people realize that they're just standing in front of a giant green screen. But to the viewer, it looks as though they're in front of a map, pointing out where the rain's coming from and the sunshine is coming in next week and so forth and so on. But the reality is far from the truth as far as what you're seeing and where and what it looks like when they're recording that video.
What do you like better? To shoot solely for art, and to be free to change, develop, augment, create, you know, whatever, or to act in a world where you doing something almost more journalistic in the case of a place or person or something that is out there in the real world that carries some real identity that you're capturing?
Well, personally, I enjoy shooting more artful images.
Is it because you're free of the constraints that we talked about, or does that not enter into it?
Yeah, that's one of the concerns. I think there are basically two types of photographers. I'd say a pretty good majority of them are extroverts, and then a portion of them are introverts. And I consider myself to be more of an introvert as far as what I produce. Now, I would also suggest that most photographers are probably their own worst critics of themselves, probably like any kind of artist. I appreciate the ability to produce photographs without any kind of constraint other than my own. And that's just a personal feeling. You know, it's easy for me to look at other people's work and compare myself, or my work to their work, and then that in itself becomes a constraint. So I appreciate ideas and motivation from others, but at the end of the day, I'd much rather just create what I perceive as artful images.
We talked about the effect that intentionality has on your subject matter. What about the effect that intentionality has on your relationship to the art form itself? Did you feel better when you were that 8-10-year-old discovering the world as you were able to fit it into your lens? Did something change when intentionality entered into what you were creating?
I guess that's a question I could ask myself day to day in comparison to what I'm shooting. And I would say yes is the answer. if I'm getting paid for a job, it's always a more constraining kind of feeling, of course, because I'm producing something for somebody in an attempt to be congruent with their intentions. Mm-hmm. Whereas, like the previous question, if I'm doing it on my own merit and I'm basing the outcome on my own intention, then it's a much more freeing kind of an experience.
What kind of equipment do you use?
Well,
and you don't have to do brands or anything.
Yeah, I mean, I still...
I'm interested in the listeners knowing the diverse types of toys that you play with.
Photography is, has been a changing medium or technology over the years. I still shoot some film, both large, medium, and small formats. And large would be, a kind of one of those old style cameras that people have seen in movies, with the bellows and the drape that goes over your head. That would be a large format camera, and I have a couple of those. I use some medium format cameras, like the one my mother gave me. It was a medium format camera. It takes 120 film, and I still have that camera. And I develop the film myself to some degree. And then I use a lot of digital equipment, which is pretty much the stuff you can buy at the big box store or online at various retailers. I'll leave those retailers out of the equation, but at the end of the day, depends on what I want to do. I've had people pay me to use analog or film on some occasions, or I've inserted that into the shoot in an attempt to be just give it a little more flair. Mm-hmm. People kind of like that. Digital, is kind of like, I compare that to like shooting fish in a barrel, where you can get instant results and see what kind of, exposure you're getting and all that good stuff before you even shoot the picture nowadays.
So some of this equipment that you have, which I had a chance to look at, I mean, you've got old fold-up travel cameras, looks like from the 50s era. Those cameras with the two lenses, one on top of the other, twin lens cameras, I think they're called. And I mean, some of them are old, and I'm sure they shoot like they're old.
Yep.
So why? And what I mean is, if they introduce imperfection, distortion, whatever it may be, because of their wear and age and deterioration, why shoot it? What does that bring to the art, if anything?
So I guess I'll give you kind of an example, and hopefully that'll answer the question. That one of my large format cameras is a 4x5 inch or 4x5 inch. It shoots a 4x5 inch negative, and it's an extremely manual process in the sense that I could get the same image much quicker with a digital camera as opposed to this camera, but the joy in using that camera, that's the large format camera, is that it's kind of like a labor of love, in the sense that I have to focus and compose my subject. I have to properly adjust the camera so that it exposes the image properly. There are some movements with the camera that I can introduce that will alter the final outcome of the image. And then there's the development process. I'm sure I'm missing one or two other pieces, but it's a very technical process to shoot that camera and come out with an intended outcome. Whereas with modern equipment like digital cameras, maybe a mirrorless camera, you can literally see either in the eyepiece or on the back of the camera the image even before you shoot it. So it presents you with a rendering of what you're going to end up with before you capture the image. Mm-hmm. And that old analog process is a much more labor-intensive process, but it's like, again, it's a labor of love in the sense that it takes a lot more planning to produce an outcome.
Would you say that you enjoy the craft of photography as much as the art?
Yeah.
Is that a fair distinction
That's
to
a
make?
fair distinction, yeah. I mean, it's, again, I look at other people's work and I can appreciate, based on what kind of equipment they used, what they were able to produce. Mm-hmm. And that's without understanding the technical details, sometimes people don't realize what goes into making an image.
Are you better when more is demanded of you, in the sense that you talked about the labor-intensive requirements for certain equipment to get the image that you want? Does it force you to use the best of your abilities to capture that image, as opposed to I'll take 100 and see what comes out? Do you notice a difference in your product?
I guess that's a kind of a double-edged kind of answer too, because if I'm being paid, it forces me to enter a frame of mind and be more meticulous about the image or the process of shooting it. But I can't say that I feel as though I may shoot better because of that. Certainly everybody has good days and bad days. I've made mistakes. But at the same time, I've been on enough shoots professionally that I understand that I need to do my best at any given moment for any given shot. Again, depending on the intention and the final outcome. It's kind of like driving a car. It's you don't want to get to the point where you're so overcome with thinking the process through that you can't get yourself to start the car. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I want to go back to something, though. The introduction of imperfection. You were talking about more labor-intensive mechanical processes, older cameras and things like that. But what if those cameras, because of their lens condition or whatever it might be, they're going to do something to the image that they capture? Either they're going to distort it, or they're going to flare it out, or whatever it might be. Do you use that, and why?
Yes. The answer to that question is yes. The why, can vary. Again, depending on what I want to see in the final image. I can give you an example of one of those processes, and that would be what they call free lensing, where you could take a 35 millimeter camera, whether it's film or digital, and you would literally disconnect the lens from the camera. And if you hold it at an angle to the flange of the camera, the lens that is, you can introduce distortion, or what they call a vignette, to the image. And that image is distorted in a way that can be perceived as artful. Mm-hmm. And you can do that with a variety of things with photography, lighting, exposure, composition. I mentioned that large format camera before. It has what they call movements, where you can tilt the lens off axis, again rendering distortion into the frame. And you can use a variety of different lenses. Some lenses produce a wide angle field of view. Other lenses can produce a large depth of field, so that perhaps portion of the frame is in focus and the rest of the frame is completely blurred out. And again, it's I guess the word that comes to mind is perspective, in the sense that you can use all these photographic tools to render the image in a certain perspective. That would be the answer as to why.
And so you're taking something that is in front of you,
Mm-hmm.
but you're going to capture it in a way that, let's say, tells the truth of that image through something other than just its geographical Cartesianal coordinates.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that it's put together. If you're looking at a mountain, you're going to convey an image that is something other than its color, height, width. You're going to tell some other truth, but the truth is told the way you describe it, it seems, through an inaccuracy. That by introducing something that is not necessarily an accurate image of the subject, you engage with your viewer and tell them something more about what you're shooting.
Or sometimes less.
And why less?
Again, perspective. What it is I want to tell the viewer. Again, you could look at some of, again, Ansel Adams' work, and he shot landscapes and mountainscapes, and all of his images were very grand and compelling. But had he used a lens with a more tighter or narrower field of view, his final image would have been a whole different story. Would have rendered a different perspective.
Do you feel that maybe it's not so much about the subject at all? It's not, I want you to see this mountain, but maybe I want you to see this mountain differently.
Mm-hmm.
Or I want you to see it the way I see it.
It could be said. That could be said for pretty much any artist, I would think.
Is part of the goal of photography to see something that you've seen before in a different way?
That could be one of the goals. Sure.
Is difference itself enough? And what I mean is it enough to provide an image that is just unexpected? Or is there some component of depth? Does the differentness of the perspective of a known thing have to have some interpretive depth to have value? Or is the newness or differentness sufficient?
It depends on the intention of a given photograph. Again, if it's a photograph of a product or a place or perhaps a person that is, for lack of a better word, for sale, then I would suspect you would want that image to be more realistically captured. In meaning that, what does it look like in real life? Now, there's nothing wrong with portraying that item or person, place, or thing in its best light. Certainly, I guess it could be said that any given object could look better in the daylight than it does at night. But if your intention is to portray that image in a different manner, certainly you could photograph it at night, and using various techniques, you can make it look very interesting.
This goes back to the dawn of the art form, doesn't it? I mean, when I look at catalogs of like Stieglitz and before. Now you can tell me if I'm missing something, but it seems to me that there was never a time when people were saying, we have this great new invention, a camera, and we can show something just exactly the way that it is. I mean, maybe for journalism. But I mean, even those early portraiture, nature, landscape photographs, it all seemed to introduce a high level of intentionality in lighting, shadow, posing, whatever it might be. It doesn't seem like for having an art form whose sort of fundamental mode is to just grab the light as it exists. There was almost never a time when that was considered enough. There was always something more to be expressed.
I guess that's fair to say. But at the same time, you mentioned the journalistic perspective. It depends on what the intent is with the photo. You know, if you would apply those same perspective and techniques that you mentioned to, say, a Sears catalog from the 80s or the 70s before the internet existed,
right,
and you were to photograph, a children's rocking horse with a wet plate, I don't know that there'd be a lot of kids out there that would want a ghostly looking rocking horse. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
It depends on, I think there's a line between art and images that aren't artful, and how much perspective you're willing to bend, again, with the intent of what the image is to be used for.
Do photographers generally trust that the viewer knows the difference? I mean, is there a
no?
This is not a commentary on the state of journalism, but and my question is, are there context clues about the photograph even? Almost the way somebody uses body language or the tone of their voice, that somebody says, I realize that someone is trying to show me something as it is in real life, so to speak, versus I know that this person is asking me to go on a leap with them.
I think that's a yes or no question, and I would say, again, another analogy or example would be one of today's social media tools would be Instagram, and the thing that was neat or cool about Instagram when it first came out was that people were posting images that looked like they were taken with a Polaroid camera, an expired film from the 80s or 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody thought, oh, wow, that image looks so retro.
Mm-hmm.
There's some feel about the tones of that color and the images that just, wow, they take me back. Mm-hmm. And the funny thing about it is, you might not be able to buy new Polaroid film, but certainly you could find it if you wanted to find it, and you could produce photographs with an analog camera and film that don't need Instagram filters. So I guess the answer to your question is yes, you can provide visual cues, but again, I guess it depends. Instagram is a medium. It's a digital format, and people initially, I think, clamored for it because of the way those images looked and felt. Mm-hmm. And certainly the viewers of that content, as well as the producers of that content, were, for lack of a better word, abusing that medium. And I think that the vast majority of Instagram's early users were well aware of the fact that those images were manipulated.
It makes me go back to something you said earlier about the intentions of the subject themselves. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have, let's say, teenagers, for example, mm-hmm. Making a picture that looks like it's from expired 70s Polaroid film. And of mm-hmm. course, they weren't alive
right
in the 70s. They maybe have never shot a Polaroid.
Right.
But somehow that style of image is in their, let's call it, cultural knowledge,
right,
or collective, memories, mm-hmm. kind of, and so they say, well, let's envision ourselves this way, as though it had been, but it's an impossibility. It's an anachronism.
So my response to that is, you mentioned teenagers, and we live in an era where photography is attainable by anybody, including teenagers, that possesses a smartphone mm-hmm. or a digital camera, and they can portray themselves in an image, and they can be the subject. And certainly, I think the word vanity can pop up pretty easily with a large number of not just teenagers, but people in general, where they want to make themselves look different than they really are. And that this is, I think, the first. This is, I think there's been a lot of self-portraits in the past where people have done the same thing, but we live in an era now where photography has become a medium that is it can be used in such a way that it's commonplace for people to do that every day without any regard.
Does it bother you that in some ways you having your camera, whatever special cameras you have, whatever historical or state-of-the-art equipment you have, in some sense that doesn't delineate you at all? I mean, I wonder, is it frustrating to say, I've developed over a lifetime a set of crafts and skills, but now everybody around me has a camera. You go in a room and there's 24 cameras in the room, and frequently more than one of them is going off at any given time, just capturing.
Right.
And I mean, does it? In some sense, there isn't anything technologically that you could bring to anybody. Maybe what you bring is the possibility for different perspective. I mean, is that what makes a photographer now?
If you look at some of the larger camera manufacturers, and I'll leave names out. All photographers tend to have a brand that they maybe cut their teeth on or have become more accustomed to or appreciate more than a next brand, or maybe they were handed down a camera and they stuck with that brand because the lenses fit on the next generation of newer and better technology. I think you would find that camera manufacturers in the last 20 years have really struggled. And they've struggled in the sense that they're competing with the rise of the phone, the smartphones and the gadgetry on those smartphones to compete with what used to be tools that professionals themselves would use.
Had to have.
They had to have. Yeah, I mean, you could shoot, maybe back in the 70s, maybe 80s, you could shoot a wedding with a point and shoot 35 millimeter camera and come up with okay results, but you weren't really competing with anybody else. But nowadays, again, everybody has a camera in their hand, and like you said, you could be in a room full of people and everybody's shooting an image, or 12 or 150,
and anybody can do anything with you.
And they could edit them and apply an Instagram filter and post it on any form of social media and have it uploaded instantly. And certainly, I don't want to say that's a competition, but I guess what bothers me is it takes away from the art form in photography, where the art has become weakened in the sense that it's now photography is mainstream, and people, for the most part, I think, don't appreciate some common technical aspects or artful perspective of any given image. It's just become a commonplace thing. I mean, it saddens me to think of all the people that take pictures of their children when they're growing up, and they have a history of years on their phone, and they never really print many of those images. It's kind of a bummer to think about that. I have kids of my own that grew up in both the analog and digital eras, and my youngest would say to me, "Well, why do you have more pictures of that kid and not as many of me?" And the answer is because of the format or the medium that I use to shoot them. With the older kids, excuse me, I tended to use film because that was what was readily available. And with the younger kid, digital had made its way into the world, and that had become more acceptable. And like I had just said, those images might be stored away on a hard drive somewhere, or on a phone, or a memory card, or who knows where the analog images, it was more commonplace to just print those images. Now there's pros and cons to both of those formats or mediums. But at the time, it was apparent to one or two of the viewers of those images as to, well, there was more quantity as opposed to perhaps the other way around. I mean, there could have, and I've tried to keep up with printing equally for all my kids, but it's, I would assume you know what I'm talking about because you have kids of your own. I guess going back to your original question, in some sense, photography has become less appreciated as technology has moved forward. And I think you mentioned earlier about some old photographers that used that old equipment. And at the time when photography came out, it was it was almost a miracle. Somebody was able to freeze time and then produce it later for other people to see. And nowadays, it's a commonplace. I don't even know what you want to call it. It's not really even an art anymore. It's just something that people do as a novelty.
Does this mean you have to push the envelope further? If we talked about the introduction of imperfection. Is it that, and that's just my terminology, you may call it something different, but is providing not only a new perspective, but maybe even a more and more unexpected perspective, where the art is forced as a result of the number of cameras and access?
I would say that's a non-issue. You can look back in history and look at any number of given photographers that were successful and say, wow, this photographer had a very distinct way of shooting. And when compared to another photographer, that may have been the case. And I think that is maybe a photographic voice that somebody acquires over time, or that has a skill that they're able to use. And again, it's a style. It's like writing. Different writers have different writing styles, or different painters have different painting styles. That has, I think, less to do with the technology or medium than what we were talking about previously, and that is that the art of photography has become cheapened with the advancement of technology. I can't say that I feel more challenged. I think I have clients that come to me because they have seen my work and understand what I'm able to produce. Where they're going to approach me perhaps before they reach out to their teenager that has a brand new smartphone with the latest filters on it.
They know your voice, your photographic voice.
Yep.
So I want to go back to something we said earlier. We use the words craft and art. Do you consider part of the photography that you do, whether it's products or places or whatever it might be, craft, or is it all art to you? And where is the line? What does it depend on? What you're shooting? Does it depend on, to go back to another concept we use, the degree of intentionality that you exercise?
Try to break into that response. So I think that if I'm hired to shoot a photograph or photographs for somebody, that they're coming to me because of the craft that I'm able to produce. And I got into the art of photography, for lack of a better word, because it was artful. It gave me an outlet, and I appreciate a good photograph. Now, one of the things that performing my craft or exhibiting my craft for somebody that might be paying me for it is because of my artful skills. Again, you use the word voice, my photographic voice, and I would say that might render the artful side of things as to what I'm able to produce. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's kind of how I perceive that question.
What is it like to capture a moment that will never exist again?
So when I was 8 years old, I didn't think about that when I tripped the shutter on a camera. And I didn't think about that when I was in my teens. And gee, I really didn't think about that too much when I, was in my early 20s. But certainly, the more photographs I've taken, the more apparent that issue has become. When I was 8, I thought it was very interesting, for lack of a better word, to be able to capture a moment in time and freeze it. I can look at slides of images that one of my aunts produced. I have a good collection of slides that she used. She used slide film for some reason back in the 70s, and it was popular back then. But I don't know if she realized it, but she has left me with images frozen in time, images from things that I have no recollection of on a personal level, but I'm able to look back and see myself maybe as a baby or a child. And I can give you a kind of a poignant example. I was hired to shoot a wedding a number of years back, and it was a very gorgeous wedding. Bride was pretty, the groom was handsome. It was a younger crowd as far as the bridesmaids and groomsmen. They were all very good-looking people. And we did some photos both in this church as well as the reception and outside at a pretty gardens. And all the photographs, they really didn't require me to do much other than to capture images of these gorgeous, pretty people. And it would have been harder for me to produce a bad picture than it would have been to just aim the camera and shoot and have a good image come out. And so the wedding was over, and before the wedding started, I met with the bride and groom, and I explained to the bride that it would be a few weeks before she had her final images. And so the wedding come to an end. I left, congratulated the bride and groom, told them I'd talk to them in a few weeks, and said goodbye and said, I hope you have a good honeymoon. I think they were going to the Bahamas or some spot in the Caribbean that was far away. And 2 or 3 days later, I get a phone call, and I didn't pick my phone up. I got a voicemail, and it was the bride calling me frantically, wanting to speak to me about the pictures. And so I called her back and said, hey, what's up? You're still on your honeymoon, right? And she said yes. And I could tell she had some kind of consternation in her voice. And here, she wanted to know if I could possibly get her some of the photos as soon as possible, because a couple days after they went on their honeymoon, the bride's mother had died unexpectedly. And she wanted to know if I could get some photos to her so that they could display them at her mother's viewing for the funeral. And never, had it occurred to me prior to that as to what the camera was capable of doing. And that was, a solid look back in time, journaling and chronicling a better period in somebody or somebody's lives. It was pretty overwhelming, to have that, not only that ability, but the responsibility to produce images that she just didn't have. And so I think that answers the question. But I've been well aware even prior to that, as far as, being in the right light or being at the right place at the right time. I remember I often drive around and see things, maybe street scenes, and I think, oh wow, that would be make for a really cool picture. But then I'll catch myself and think, yeah, but I need to wait till about 4 or 5 o'clock when the sun is at a different angle. I need to come back next week, maybe when the snow's melted off. That kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's 2 levels of that, I think, and maybe more, but certainly the first one is an example that's more profound, and the second and third example are more of just a situational kind of an awareness.
Yeah, but you live then in relationship to time.
Mm-hmm.
Both the time as well as the images that you've fixed, and also the patience to have the image at what you think will be the right time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a popular song from the 60s or 70s that always goes through my head when I'm taking a picture, and it's Seals and Crofts. I can't remember if this is the name of the song, but a couple of the lyrics go, "We may never pass this way again."
Hmm.
And when I have a camera, I'm kind of, I don't want to say I'm always mindful of that, but it frequently pops into my head that what I'm doing with that tool is something that is capable of documenting something that's later to become history.
I mean, almost everybody has at least some familiarity with that. A family takes a trip and they say, well, we want to remember when we were here.
Right.
We may not come back here. We want to have good memories of it. Or,
right.
You want to remember, so-and-so when they got their new bike or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people certainly have an immediate familiarity with that desire to capture, but it seems to me that you must live with it in a heightened way.
Yeah, when I've got a camera in my hand, I'm pretty aware of what's going on as far as time and perception of it.
So what is it that you think you're capturing? Because one way you could look at it is, I'm capturing life. I'm capturing what makes up life. The moments, the people, the interactions, the places, whatever it may be. Another way to look at it is, I'm capturing loss, because these moments are flowing interminably
right
into the past. Do you think of it one way or the other? I'm capturing life, I'm capturing loss?
Well, I guess, capturing loss to me is more literal for me, in the sense that if I'm capturing loss, when I hear that phrase, I'm capturing loss, to me, if I'm capturing loss, I guess, for an example, I've captured images of people in caskets. And I guess the flip side of that is, you could say, but I'm also capturing life. Because that's part of life. I was in the car today and I drove by something. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I remember thinking, this didn't look this way several years ago. And I remember it was a new dollar store that popped up in the span of like 2 months or something like that. And I thought,
they go up quick.
Yeah. And I thought, I actually have some images of what this lot looked like, or this plot of land or structure that was there prior to the appearance of this new building. And is that image of value to anybody? It might be to somebody, but at the same time, I know that I have that image or images. It's a whole different scene now. Life has marched on. Is that a loss for somebody older than me? It might be. For some kid, randomly walking down the street and seeing that new dollar store go up, they might think that's great. It's life.
It's a funny experience, the one that you described, because it's frequently happened to me that I have a subconscious memory of a place. I expect it to be a certain way, and then when I get there, something has changed. It's been a year since I've been back, and maybe it's they've cut down some trees, but it's strange to not be able to identify what it is, just to be overcome with the sense that this is different, but to not know how.
What do you mean, not know how? Not know how to...
To not know why it's different from what you remember. Because while you have an expectation, the events, were so ordinary that you never bothered to record the specific detail. And so you end up confronted only with a sense of change.
Or
kind
memory.
of an unplaceable change.
Yeah, I mean, I've photographed people, and I've thought, there's a good chance I'll never be able to capture them this way ever again.
Even if they get older,
even if if it's a week later, perhaps their hair's different, or their dress is different, or maybe they have a tan. Whatever grandiose or whatever subtle changes there may have occurred in the span of just a few days. It's anything goes. That example I gave you of that bride. I mean, I can vividly recall. I have I guess I have a photographic memory, but I recall her mother, and I can recall her interacting with her daughter, the bride, both before, during, and after the wedding, clearly. Now, had she not passed away, I don't know that I would recall that as clearly had the events that occurred after the wedding not occurred. But I was there, and I was engaged in the sense that I had intended to capture the bride with her mother on numerous occasions.
You can take this sense of capturing the lost to an extreme. Like you run into people, especially when you travel, say at an art museum or something, and you see them going around the room and just taking a picture of all of the paintings, as though to have and look back on. And maybe they do. I'm not being critical, but they spend almost no time just being in the presence of the original, and perceiving it. That they're kind of collecting it, and you wonder the vast amounts of data that people have collected, just marking off, cataloging their experiences. And I wonder if at some point the drive to capture can eclipse having the experience in the first instance. What do you think about that?
That's a good question for a photographer. Because, I guess perhaps that is why maybe that bride and groom hired me, to shoot that experience for them so that they could better enjoy their wedding or their wedding day, and leave the documentation up to somebody else that they hired. And I say it's a good question for a photographer because sometimes, in my own life, as much as I enjoy freezing those moments, I also have to remember that even if I'm hired to document those experiences, I have to have an experience of my own. For example, if I'm at a wedding and I'm documenting the wedding for somebody, I'm still there. I'm still reacting to what's going on. And believe it or not, I am able to look at the images I've taken and I have a sense of emotion because I'm able to recall perhaps maybe not the fine details of what I was thinking at the time, but perhaps what I was feeling at the time. Maybe during the throwing of the bouquet or the garter ceremony or the wedding itself. I mean, I have a one of the things about taking photographs for me is it's a profound connection with not just a historical perspective, but a kind of an emotional connection to what it was I was experiencing when I shot the photo. Whether it be a photo I'm capturing for myself or my own family, but again, if it's that kind of a setting, I realize that there's more to just documenting that history. I want to be part of that memory. But at the same time, I realize that, by having that camera in my hand, I might be able to pass off a memory to one of my kids or a family member or a friend. So that's why I say it's a good question for a photographer.
Do you feel like you're drowning in collected images?
No. I mean, today's technology, the ability to store information as far as photographs go or documentation of images is pretty much a non-issue. We have the ability to again shoot fish in a barrel with a digital camera. And images that I capture that I want to retain, I have no problem doing that.
Yeah, I guess what I mean more is the volume of images. I mean, it makes me think of what you said earlier about how you have a bunch of pictures but you don't print them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the correlation of images taken and images printed is much different than it was 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes I feel like a phenomenon in my own life where you think to yourself, okay, I've got it. Mm-hmm. I got that image, that place, that event, whatever it might be. But then you never do return to it. It's like the taking of it is enough, and you file it away. And I have folders and folders of the last 2 decades of my life. Rarely do you take the time to go through them. What does that mean? I mean, what does that mean for the thing that is photography?
So I can think of a specific place that I go to, and I go there in different seasons and different times because I want to capture an image of that same place in different light and different perspectives. I can't say that I feel as though I'm drowning in it. I do it intentionally because I want to I want to recall, or I want to see how that same place looks differently in different times. The flip side is, sure, it's like I mentioned earlier. People have taken photography and turned it into, I don't know, just an expression of, I'm not even sure what you would call it. And I guess I could be consider myself guilty of that to some degree, but I would say, if I'm trying to capture an image on my own behalf for an artistic reason, I tend to treasure that image more than I would, if I'm taking a picture of, I don't know, maybe my car before I change the brakes. I take the wheel off and document an image of what the car looked like before I disassembled it, so that if I need to put it back together, I can have a better recollection of what goes where. I mean, there's more than one reason to take a photo, I guess, is what it boils down to. And the ability to photograph is something that I think most people just take for granted.
What's it like to work with a model?
Well, depends on what or who the model is, I guess. I mean, I've worked with, like I said earlier, I worked with somebody that was trying to get into politics. Done that on numerous occasions, and sometimes those people, they're modeling themselves.
Let's imagine a more vulnerable type of modeling. I mean, I'm imagining you're in your studio, you're shooting a person
who wants to,
for whatever reason, they want portfolio, or it's
right.
It's for it's for portfolio or something like that. And you're there posing the light, working. What is that? What is that like to have that kind of visual control over a human subject?
Well, I guess there has to be an intention of what it is that person is envisioning and trying to capture images for them that they want. I can't say that I feel as though I have control over what those... I guess I have control over the outcome of the images, but again, I need to understand what the model or the person wants to see. Some people have a clear understanding of what their vision is, whereas other people come to me and rely on my vision, to which, I try to gather as much information from that person as I can, as to what they'd like to see. And I do my best to manipulate the photo in the best way I can. And I enjoy the artistic piece of portraiture.
And my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that people come to you who are unknown, want to be discovered or whatever it is, and they may hire you to shoot them. What is it that you feel they want? What is it that they want you to capture, generally speaking?
Generally speaking, my impression of those people's intentions is that, like a real estate agent, they want to sell something. And that something is their image. And many times those people want to sometimes appear better than they might look like at any given time in real life. As long as I'm not photoshopping a tattoo on them or photoshopping out 150 pounds.
Can you do that?
Well, I mean, maybe. I'd say that the less manipulation, the easier it is. Put it that way. But a lot of times, those people want to look better than what they might look like I said, in any given light. And sometimes it's very easy to manipulate a photo like that. May not require much technical skill. But with the proper use of light and equipment, posing, various lenses, depth of field, you can do a lot of things to cast or to produce an image of somebody in a very artistic manner.
Is it true that people hire you to shoot them nude? Models who seek out photographers have hired you for this?
I mean, I've had all kinds of requests. Some of which I've said no to because their requests seem quite unusual or uncomfortable. People have contacted me to photograph them and engaging in who knows what kind of acts, and I've had to turn them down. Just doesn't seem like something I'd be interested in photographing. Again, it's there's a, I guess it depends on somebody's definition of what's artistic, I guess, if that's what they're after.
Well, that's my question, is what do you think is going on? What from your experience in working with models, what do you think they're asking you to capture, or what is it about themselves they're trying to reveal?
So to answer that question, I guess I'll go back to what we may have touched on briefly a little while ago, and that is we live in an era where people are very familiar with social media, and I feel as though a lot of times people, for lack of a better description, may be somewhat narcissistic in the sense that they want to see images of themselves that are better than they look like in real life. I get a sense that there's a lot of people out there that may be somewhat vain to some degree. Maybe they feel insecure about themselves, and they want to look good. I feel as though there's a certain percentage of people out there that are like that. But then there are other people that, I've taken pictures of people that have later become actors or professional models, and I've seen them move on to bigger and better things. But what I think there's certainly a trend out there, again, with social media, and it's unfortunate that much like I say, I try not to compare my work to other photographers' work. I find that there are people out there that compare images of themselves to images of other people. And that's kind of a sad reality, but I think that's a pretty prevalent thing that's going on right now, especially in especially in an era where people have grown up with social media and at-will photography, for lack of a better description.
Why the rawness?
I guess you could ask the same question about any photo. The person might be after that quote-unquote rawness in the same way that a photographer may choose to produce a photo. A photographer might decide to shoot a landscape or a street shot. The photographer may expose so that the shadows are less profound, and reduce the highlights in an image so that the sky appears a little bluer than maybe what it really looked like. That could go either way. With anybody or anything or any photographer, really. You know, the final outcome can be either realistic or it could be somewhat of a manipulated story.
So what you're saying is you do it too. It's not just the subjects that want to appear as something that they may hope for. The artist also is unsatisfied with taking a picture of a landscape and saying, here's the landscape, go up around that bend and take a look at it, and this is what you'll see. They want to make it their own. They want to interpret it in some way that makes it their own, that realizes their own voice.
I guess that's a fair assessment. You raise another point, and that is, I think there's a difference between taking a photo and making a photo. And I don't know if that makes sense, but it's easy to take a photo, which I think the majority of people do in their lives, but it's different to actually make a photo in the sense that there could be a little embellishment or a little reduction or a little alteration from the truth.
It strikes me that the models that you have worked with are not just physically but psychologically bare to you, because in their own aspirations for what your work will show, they kind of have to reveal what they hope for themselves.
If their intention is to appear in a better light or an unrealistic fashion, then yes, I do see them, for lack of a better expression. I understand what their intentions are, and I wouldn't be able to produce what they want without knowing what it is that they're looking for.
Do you similarly have to be psychologically honest with yourself to take a great picture? I mean, do you have to say, I know that I'm not actually shooting this alley. I'm shooting the way I feel about this relationship that has come to an end or something.
The question could be better asked by saying, do I want to interject my emotion into this image? And I would say quite frequently, yes. I can look at an image that I've taken years ago and recall what I was feeling.
Something I've always thought about being a photographer, and in light of the things we've talked about, you can tell me if you think this is accurate or not. I'm rethinking it a little bit in light of our conversation, but I always thought to be a photographer would be great because it's like you're on a scavenger hunt for your entire life, and you're constantly looking for that unique place, setting, person, coincidence, whatever it might be. You're out there looking and finding and capturing, and almost as though it was a way to model your life on a constant discovery. But I wonder if that's at all accurate as I listen to our conversations about the role that you have in the product, the role that you have in shaping the output.
One of the earliest recognized color photographers was William Eggleston. And he embraced color photography. He was one of the first ones to embrace it. And my perspective of his work is that he photographed what was in front of him. And by saying that, what I'm trying to say is, his scavenger hunt, from my perspective, was limited in the sense that, he I don't think he lived in a place where there were sweeping, dramatic landscapes or amazing waterfalls. His scavenger hunt was kind of mundane, I think, in the sense that he was able to produce images that were uniquely appealing, and they were of things that just were commonplace. So I guess the answer to your question is, yeah, there's a scavenger hunt from a photographic perspective, but at the same time, the photographer's palette may not appeal to somebody. Their scavenger hunt and the results of their scavenger hunt may not appeal to somebody else. And I use Eggleston as an example because the photographers that were well known at the time, did not really accept color photography as a artful medium, and B, Eggleston's perspective to them wasn't valued at the time. So, I guess to answer your question without being too vague is, yeah, there's always a scavenger hunt, and being able to produce something of meaning is kind of a subjective thing.
Maybe it's less about me, the photographer, going out to search. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's more about having your eyes open to what's at hand.
Correct.
I mean, I think of a photograph that always stuck with me as a Teenie Harris photograph about a young boy. I don't know, maybe he's 10 or 9. It must have been some kind of boxing, I don't know, training, or I don't know where it came from, but he's in the corner of a ring with these gigantically oversized gloves, on his hands, and he's crying.
I can imagine the photo right now.
Yeah. And I thought, to live in a space where you can see the uniqueness of that image for what it is, and to know its poignancy, has got to be very fulfilling.
Yeah, but I guess if you were to show that image to, an 18-year-old kid on a bus, would I don't know that image would stand out to him.
Would arrest him.
Yeah.
So maybe the photographer is cataloging, and it's the viewer that's on the search.
It's possible.
And you come in there with your perspective and say, find something here in my work.
Right.
Look again.
Yeah, I mean, I've developed, I guess a style of my own. And, one of the things that I like to do on occasion is I like to catch the mundane and try to throw it into a perspective that I find appealing. Try to find some beauty in something that otherwise might be perceived as something that's rather ugly or mundane. I think most photographers try to do that. To what extent, I don't know.
I mean, that itself is a very laudable quest. I mean, to elevate the mundane,
Right.
to see in it fully what it may be.
Right.
Especially, as you said earlier, in relationship to time, as it's either coming into existence or fading away.
Right.
To put it in a broader scope.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen really bad images of pretty people, places, and things, and I've seen really good images of trash.
Yeah.
Scraps of metal.
Equally compelling.
Right.
I mean, it makes me think of like war photography, where the image might be terrible. It's just it's jostled. It's not clear. The lighting is bad. Whatever it might be, but it's the image, the known image of whatever it is. These soldiers going up over the trench.
Right.
At Verdun or something, and it's like it's not the craft of the image; it's the fact that the camera was there at that moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of times people ask, and it's something that I ask: what does this image? What story is this image telling me? I'm not saying that for every image that needs to be successful, that it needs to tell a story, but many artful pictures do tell a story, like you just described. There's a lot of great black and white photos from the Depression era. You described one with a boy with boxing gloves, but how many black and white photos are out there that just tell a story? And the medium, I think, to take it a step further, black and white photography prior to color really conveyed a much clearer story, in the sense that there were no pops of color. It was just contrast on display.
Contrast and composition.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Things were much simpler.
Yeah, again, I mean, it almost goes back to what we were talking about earlier about discipline.
Mm-hmm.
And if you restrict the scope of what's possible, does it shape then the art that you create? I mean, I guess that's a truism. Of course, if you have different available inputs, it's going to shape the art. But does it shape the discipline of the artist?
I guess the answer is yes, it can. I've seen images that I consider to be stunning, that are of just very simple subjects. It's just a matter of disciplining the photographer, disciplining his eye and maintaining a perspective and being able to produce an image that is just unique.
It's interesting to me to hear you talk about the story of a photograph, because I think there's a tendency to think a photographer is a visual artist, and their art form is visual, and so they're concerning themselves with images. But the way you describe it, it makes me wonder whether you are not a collector of images, but a collector of stories. It's just you're not telling them with words.
I guess that's a fair assumption. You could consider a photograph a collection of information. Certainly, photographs can be used for documentation. But the flip side of that, like you said, is it could be perceived or used as a mode of communication. If you look at ancient writings, like hieroglyphs, certainly they didn't use symbols, they used images. And, I can't say that I speak that language, but certainly, if you look at some Egyptian work, there's always a pharaoh with a design,
Flail and a crook.
That and the bird flying over the sun. I mean, the Incas did that. It's just kind of crazy to think that meant something to somebody. Can you interpret it?
Yeah, it's almost like every culture, let's say, imports complex meanings to certain symbols that other cultures do not import.
Right.
And so maybe what that means is you're not able to collect stories because you really can't predict the story that the viewer will overlay your image with. But maybe you're collecting something in between an image and a story. You're collecting like the hypothesis of a story. You're collecting platforms for meaning.
Possible to be a collector of emotion that way too. I guess a different perspective is, if you look at an image, at least with my eye, I can look at an image and say, oh, this photo must have been taken in the afternoon because of the angle of the shadow. Or this photo was taken with 3 off-camera flashes because of the direction of the lighting. Now, granted, I can see that because I've trained myself to look at an image and look at those details. But like you said, people might miss out on certain details in any given photograph.
Something that's always interesting to me when I look at pictures is the way that the photographer uses light, and what he or she chooses to illuminate or shadow, and how they get the light to the right place to create the mood, to reveal or hide what they choose. Tell me about your relationship to light as a photographer.
I guess I'll go back to when I was 8, using that Brownie camera that my mom gave me, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I was basically capturing light on an analog plane, and when that film was developed, it would be basically a collection of that reflected light. I think I also mentioned that as I got older, I was better able to plan the outcome. But the interpretation of that statement is I was able to better control the light that had entered the camera. So I don't know if that would make sense to you or anybody listening, but without light, there really is no photograph.
Mm-hmm.
And it's scientifically speaking, everything we see is a result of reflected light. And once you're able to, as a photographer, understand and respect how light works, you're better able to control the output of a photo.
So then maybe the real question is, what's your relationship to the seen and the unseen? How do you control for what you reveal to your viewer, what you hide, and why?
I mean, that's a pretty broad question. And again, it's, good photographers are well aware of the bag of tricks that they possess. Whether it's composition or lighting or focus or lack thereof, field of view, and other things. It's a matter of, again, it's perspective of the photographer using the tools that they have to relay an image to a viewer onto that film plane or the digital medium that they're using.
I remember a quote I read once. I believe his name is pronounced Andre Malraux. Man is not what he thinks he is what he hides. And I wonder, in your creation of an image, by shadowing something, sometimes you make its absence the most important part of the image. How do you balance for that? How do you design that? How do you draw somebody into what's not there?
That's a pretty heavy question for anybody, really. I guess, you could look up at the sky at any given night and only see a portion of the moon. And unless you were born yesterday, you know that the other portion of the moon is still there. But when you see only half a moon or a crescent moon, your interpretation is such that you only are presented with what you have. I can't shine a flashlight bright enough to illuminate the other half of that moon or that portion that is darkened. So I guess a photographer is able to use light or the lack thereof in the same way. I mean, if I photograph a person and I only use ambient light to capture them in, I know that image is going to look somewhat different than if I use an artificial light to capture them with, like a flash or a strobe. Those three options, the ambient use of an artificial light, they all have a different outcome in revealing or hiding detail or information. I would say that could be analogous to a writer deciding to detail something or leave it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like the violence that takes place off stage, in Elizabethan plays, so that it could be more virulently imagined than could be performed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it makes me think of what you said earlier about stories. The photograph is a story, and if whether or not the use of light and shadow provides for the story by providing something to go into, some thing to be explored, some unknown to be answered, creation of mystery.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask you something I've always been interested in. Photographs often show you things that can't be seen. I mean, in one sense, we talked about capturing a time or a person that is no longer there, a place that you can't return to. It's been knocked down. In that sense, yeah. But even if you were to go to the same place at the same time of day in the same season, the photograph was captured in such a way because of the lens or the effect that was put on it or whatever it might be, that you could never perceive it with your eyes the way that it's perceived with the technology, with photographing, with the equipment that you have. What's the appeal or the purpose of showing somebody an image that can't be seen?
If somebody's walking through life with rose-colored glasses, or if they're walking through life with dark brown glasses, for lack of a better expression, it's a matter of just influencing somebody or presenting them with an image of something as you or the photographer sees it. And again, I guess that would render a different perspective.
It's the possibility to shake somebody up.
It's a possibility to shake somebody up, or to reveal a truth, or to manipulate somebody into thinking or believing or feeling differently.
At the other end of the spectrum, I feel that the human eye can see things that can never be technologically captured, at least not as we know it now. On the one hand, you use your skill in photography to show somebody a scene as they couldn't possibly see it. But on the other hand, how many times are you overtaken by the sheer scope of a scene, and you say something like, you could never capture it. At least I have felt completely incapable of rendering an image that looks to me like what it was like to be there. I don't know if it has to do with the three-dimensionality of the view, the angle of vision, the metering of your eye, but sometimes even the way you look in yourself in a mirror. And nobody ever seems to be able to take a picture of you that looks the way you look to yourself, looking right at yourself in the glass. Why is that?
I think the phrase that comes to mind for me is, photograph doesn't do it justice.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And I guess, I don't know that it's just photograph. Maybe it's an audible format. I perceive myself sounding differently than I actually do.
Yeah, we probably all do.
Yeah. I went on a hike recently, and I went to a spot in West Virginia where certainly it's easy to say a photograph doesn't do this place justice, and that's true. All I can do is attempt to reproduce what I saw to the best of my ability, given my skill, given my equipment, given the light or the time of day.
I mean, do you find yourself in a situation where you feel that it's insurmountable to capture what you perceive?
Mm-hmm. And I guess, I guess there's a fine line between being unable to capture an image and, relaying the emotion that might be incurred during the presence of whatever scene I might be experiencing. I mean, photography is really only about one transmission of information, and that is a visual transmission. There, you can take it a little step further and say the visual transmission rendered an emotion or a reaction, but there are limits with any form of transmission of information or data, in the sense that if you're listening to an album, maybe an old vinyl LP, those albums, that old medium, analog medium, renders a different impact than maybe a digitally reproduced recording. And the same can be said about hearing the same music when it's played live, as opposed to a reproduction. So I would say in that sense, it could almost be said, just like a photograph doesn't do this place justice or this scene justice, I guess the same thing could be said about, wow, a recording of this music or this sound really can't render the same reaction, if that makes sense.
You have to tell the truth that is tellable in the medium that you have.
Mm-hmm.
And so it may be the same truth, but it may be told in a different way.
Or it may be interpreted a different way, correct? Mm-hmm. Or perceived a different way.
And so the solution is not always, I'm looking at a scene of tremendous scope. And so I need to go as big as possible with the technology available to me to capture the scope of what I see. Sometimes it might be exactly the opposite. I need to bring to the fore a piece of this scope that conveys the whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I recently shared a photograph of a little crawfish that I spotted in West Virginia a couple weeks ago, and I composed the images intentionally to focus on that object. The object itself was unique, but I didn't relay a really large sense of scale to show you that little crawfish, who happened to be very blue, was on a trail in the middle of the woods in West Virginia. You could see him, and you could see the mud that he was in and some leaves. But at the end of the day, I did not relay the entire story by showing you the trail, where I was at, the angle on which I spotted him walking. You weren't able to determine whether it was sunny that day or cloudy or rainy, really. So I just narrowed it down, the image down to the subject at hand.
Let's talk about scale for a second,
Mm-hmm.
because that's one of the things that has always intrigued me about images, is that at the right type of image, you can be completely isolated from scale. Certain types of macro rock formations, things like that, look the same as a gigantic landscape of mountains.
Mm-hmm.
bonsai trees, I find sometimes you can't tell if they're 6 inches, if they're, if they're 12 inches, if they're 2 feet.
Right.
And I guess you have the choice as the artist to make the scale perceptible or imperceptible. It's like fractals, where you have larger and larger settings that are made up of their component parts. I mean, how do you use scale to share your perspective?
I guess scale could be also related to composition. You can use various tools and techniques, possibly lighting, field of view, to relay or preclude any kind of ability to compare or contrast a subject in relation to its surroundings. Again, going back to something I said earlier, I mean, I've seen gorgeous images of that just are very simple in the sense that the photographer uses empty space in a frame to isolate something that might be very grandiose or very small. So again, the producer of a photograph, just like any piece of art, can use perspective, composition, different techniques to really manipulate perception.
It's almost like you can take something that grandiose and bring it down to a digestible scale.
Mm-hmm.
Or, as you said earlier in our conversation, to take something so familiar as to be unnoticeable and to stop and take notice of its greater implications.
Correct.
It's like a great equalization in your lens.
Well, I mean, you could get 2 photographers or 3 photographers or a dozen and ask them to photograph a given subject, and the chances are you may come away with a wide variety of perspective. Somebody might take in a wider angle of view. One photographer might take in a very small, detailed perspective of a subject. Another photographer may reveal the subject in a contrasted way that's not perceived. And that's one of the beauties about the art of photography, is that there's more than one way to skin that fish.
And you would have, I guess, maybe very different stories
Mm-hmm.
based upon what they've elected to
do.
reveal.
Yep.
What makes a great photograph?
Well, that's a good question. And again, I think a great photo tells a story. And a great photo can tell a story of something that wasn't expected. I guess these are my opinions. A great photo can move somebody. A great photo can impact the viewer both positively and or negatively. And a great photo can alter the viewer's perspective.
what is so interesting to me is that I thought you were going to say something far more technical about the composition or execution of the photograph. And it's very telling to me that you, as someone steeped in that craft, see the value of the artistic product essentially in its reception.
When I was shooting that wedding of that girl with, the loss of her mother, I was shooting in the perspective you speak of. I did not foresee the reception of it in the light that that girl had asked, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. See, I was going to ask you, does your deep knowledge of technique prevent you from seeing photos the same way? But my guess is, from the answer you gave, no.
My experience is just take the photo.
Yeah, I guess
Go ahead.
Let me ask the question a different way. I was going to ask you, does your deep knowledge of technique prevent you from really getting carried away by a photograph as a photograph? When you look at somebody else's work, are you sort of unwillingly pulled into the gravity of, oh, I see he or she did this way and that way?
No, I mean, I'm capable of seeing that latter explanation that you described, but I'm only using my quote-unquote great knowledge or skill to best render an outcome, regardless of what my intent might be or what the rationale behind that photo is. I'm still that 8-year-old kid with my mother's camera. I just got a little better.
You remember any photos recently that just carried you away?
Like seen in mainstream or something, or
anywhere? Or
give me a moment here. Go ahead.
Can you describe the types of photos or something about them that tends to just carry you away?
We're so hammered with media that I think a good number of people just believe what they see. And this may not be answering your question the way you asked it, but my experience as a photographer tells me that what I'm seeing may not actually be realistic. So with that in mind, I have seen images lately that do carry me away, but unfortunately sometimes they're not as compelling as maybe they could be to somebody that doesn't have the experience that I have with producing images.
So is it that you like an image that demonstrates to you what you know to be true, that images can lie? Or is it that you like an image when you can catch the image in its own lie?
I prefer the latter half. I mean, if it's, I have no opposition to things as they really are. good or bad. And I guess good or bad is in the eye of the beholder.
We talked about the preservation of the past in photography. At the end of your career, what do you hope to have captured with your images? Preserved.
It'd probably take me a little longer to ponder that, but just quickly I would say memories, historical facts, feelings, and like we've said before, stories.
Well, with that, it's much later even than it was when we started. So, Mr. Photographer, I have to thank you very much for your time. It's been an extraordinary conversation. Really enjoyed your perspective on these topics. Ones that have application far beyond the art of photography itself. And I appreciate you sharing your perspectives with us.
Happy to be here and happy to share. Thanks for having me.
So let me ask you, do you want to tell us who you are?
I'll stay in the shadows on that one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.